The unforgiving sun of the American West beat down on Emma Carter's shoulders, baking the dry, cracked earth of their small homestead. At 19, she carried the weight of a life far too heavy for her young frame. The scent of dust and despair hung in the air, a familiar perfume on the wind. For weeks it had been a constant companion, ever since the fever took her mother and left her and her father, Elias, to fend for themselves against a world that seemed determined to break them. Now it was worse. The silence that had descended upon the house was not the quiet of a peaceful afternoon. It was the suffocating stillness of grief. Elias Carter, a man who had weathered countless storms, both literal and metaphorical, lay cold in the humble pine box they had fashioned themselves. His death was not from illness or old age, but from a bullet, a cruel final payment on a debt he could never settle. Emma knelt by the makeshift grave, her hands covered in the same dry soil that would soon claim him. Her tears left clean tracks on her grimy cheeks, a river of sorrow flowing from her heart. She wasn't just mourning her father. She was mourning the future that had just been stolen from her. The men who had killed Elias weren't just bandits. They were the enforcers of a powerful, shadowy figure who held the deed to their land and the key to their fate. "I'm so sorry, Pa," she whispered, her voice a raw, broken thing. "I should have done more." A gust of wind kicked up a small cloud of dust, and Emma coughed, her throat dry and aching. She knew the name of the man to whom her father owed so much, John Blackjack Callahan. The name was whispered with a mix of fear and reverence throughout the county. A rancher who owned more land than anyone could measure, his reputation was as vast and untamed as his territory. He was a man of legend, a loner who had built his empire on sheer will and a sharp eye for business. The story was that Blackjack didn't forgive debts. He collected them. Panic, a cold, sharp knife, twisted in Emma's gut. The bandits had left a chilling message scrawled on the door of their barn. "Callahan's coming for his due." She had 1 week. 1 week to come up with the money her father didn't have, or lose the only thing she had left, her home. But where would a girl like her, with no money and no one to turn to, find such a sum? The answer came to her in a moment of desperate clarity. She wouldn't find the money. She would go to him, to Blackjack Callahan himself. She would plead, beg, and bargain for time. It was a fool's errand, she knew. But what other choice did she have? The alternative was destitution, and the world was not kind to women who had nothing. The journey to the Callahan ranch was long and arduous. Emma rode her father's old mare, a bony creature named Bess, who seemed to share her sense of dread. The landscape changed from the familiar, scrubby fields of their small farm to the vast, sprawling plains that belonged to the Callahan Empire. The air grew thicker with the scent of cattle and the hum of 100 men working in unison. When she finally arrived, the sheer scale of the place took her breath away. The ranch house was not a humble cabin like her own. It was a grand 2-story structure of polished wood and stone, surrounded by corrals bustling with livestock and a veritable army of cowboys. Emma felt a tremor of fear, a mouse standing before a lion's den. A cowboy with a kind face and a weathered hat saw her and approached cautiously. "Can I help you, miss?" I need to see Mr. Callahan," Emma said, her voice barely a whisper. The cowboy, whose name was Sam, raised an eyebrow. "Blackjack? He don't see nobody unless he wants to." "Please," Emma insisted, her voice gaining a desperate edge. "It's about the debt. My father, Elias Carter, he's gone. The men who came, they said Blackjack was coming. I need to explain." Sam's face softened. He knew of Elias Carter. Most people in the county did. He knew of the hard life the man had lived. He nodded slowly. "Wait here. I'll see what I can do." The wait felt like an eternity. Emma sat on a dusty bench, her hands clasped so tightly, her knuckles turned white. She watched the cowboys, their faces etched with the hard lines of their trade, their movements efficient and sure. She felt like an alien in this world of strength and power. Finally, Sam returned. "He'll see you. Follow me." He led her into the house, and Emma's senses were overwhelmed. The interior was simple but powerful. A huge stone fireplace dominated the main room, and the air smelled of leather, tobacco, and wood smoke. It was a man's world, a place of order and control. And then she saw him. John Blackjack Callahan was a man built of granite and steel. He stood by the fireplace, his back to her, a wide-brimmed hat casting a shadow over his face. He was tall, with broad shoulders that strained the seams of his leather vest. His dark hair was tied back, and when he turned, his eyes, the color of a stormy sky, met hers. They were cold, devoid of emotion, and they seemed to see right through her, to the very core of her desperation. "You're Elias Carter's daughter," he stated, his voice a low rumble that vibrated in the air. It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir, Emma Carter," she managed to say. "My father, he's passed on. He was murdered." Blackjack's eyes didn't flicker. "I know." A tremor went through Emma. "The men who came, they said you were coming, to collect the debt." "I am." His gaze was unblinking. "Your father owed me $3,000, a loan to save his farm. He never paid a cent. And now, he never will." Emma's eyes welled with fresh tears. "I know, sir, and I have nothing to offer you, but please, I'm asking for your mercy. I can work. I can find a way. Just give me time. Don't take our land. It's all I have left." Blackjack walked slowly toward her, his boots making no sound on the wooden floor. He stopped a few feet away, his towering presence making her feel even smaller. He reached for a glass of whiskey on a nearby table and took a slow sip, his eyes never leaving her face. "Time, miss? Time is a luxury I don't have," he said, his voice as hard as the stones of his fireplace. "And mercy is a word that doesn't exist in my world. The law of the land is that a debt must be paid." Emma's heart sank. This was a man without a soul, a force of nature. "Then what can I do?" Blackjack took another sip of his whiskey. A long, silent moment stretched between them. The only sound was the crackle of the fire and the distant lowing of a cow. He looked her up and down, his eyes lingering on her weary frame, her dirt-stained dress and her tear-streaked face. It wasn't a look of lust, but one of cold calculation. Finally he spoke, and the words were not what she expected. "Your father's debt is $3,000. It's a small amount to me," he said, his voice low and deliberate, "but it's a matter of principle. A man's word is his bond. Your father broke his." He set his glass down on the mantelpiece, the clink echoing in the room. "I will forgive the debt. I will give you more than just time." His gaze hardened, and the chilling words that followed would change Emma's life forever. "But you will pay in a different currency. You will become my wife, and you will bear me heirs to my empire as payment." The words hung in the air, a cruel and impossible proposition. "You will become my wife, and you will bear me heirs to my empire as payment." Emma's mind reeled. The idea was so outlandish, so devoid of human feeling, that for a moment she thought she must have misunderstood. She stared at him, her tear-filled eyes wide with shock. A wife, to this cold, intimidating stranger, to bear his children. The very thought was an assault on her senses. She had come to plead for mercy, to beg for time, not to sell herself into a life she couldn't even begin to comprehend. "Sir, I don't understand," she stammered, her voice trembling. That's not a payment. That's a life." Blackjack's face remained a mask of impassive stone. "Life is what it is, miss. A deal is a deal. I hold the deed to your land. I can take it, and you'll have nothing. Or you can accept my offer. My debt will be cleared, your land will remain, and you will have a home and a future. My future." He spoke as if he were discussing a business transaction, a trade of cattle or a plot of land. Emma felt a wave of nausea. He wasn't seeing her as a person, but as a resource, an asset to be acquired. What about my feelings, my choice?" she asked, a fragile sense of defiance rising within her. He scoffed, a short, humorless sound. "Feelings are a luxury of the wealthy, and choices are for those who have options. You have neither. The choice is simple. A life of poverty and uncertainty, or a life of security, even if it is one you don't choose. I don't ask for your love, only your compliance. I need an heir. You need a home. It's a fair trade. Fair. The word was a bitter taste in her mouth. How could he call this fair? It was coercion, pure and simple. Yet, as she looked at him, at the immense power he wielded, at the life he could offer, a grim realization settled in her heart. He was right. She had no other options. The world had turned its back on her. Her father was gone. Her home was in his hands. What would I have to do? She asked, her voice barely audible. You'd be my wife, he repeated as if speaking to a child. You'd live here on the ranch, you'd manage the house, and you would give me a son. A son, a legacy. He was not looking for companionship, but for a vessel to carry his name. The thought was horrifying, yet a dark logic began to take hold. What was the alternative? The streets? A life of struggle and despair? At least here she would be safe. She would have food, shelter, and a future, no matter how cold and empty it might be. The security he offered was a powerful siren song in her moment of utter desperation. Emma's head was spinning. She closed her eyes, trying to block out the image of his imposing figure, his cold, calculating eyes. She thought of her father, of the blood on the barn door, of the words of the bandits. They were real. The threat was real, and so was Black Jack's offer. She opened her eyes and met his gaze, her sorrow and fear giving way to a new kind of resolve. It was not a choice of happiness, but a choice of survival. I accept, she said, the words a difficult, ragged sound. Black Jack nodded once, a curt gesture of finality. It was done. The deal was struck. There was no handshake, no contract, only a silent, grim understanding. Good, he said. The preacher will be here in a week. We'll be married then. He turned and walked away, the conversation seemingly over. Emma stood there in the middle of the grand room, a girl who had just sold her life for a home. She felt a profound sense of loss, a chilling emptiness that was far worse than the fear she had felt before. She had just buried her father, and now she had buried her own future. Sam, the cowboy who had led her in, came back, his face a mixture of pity and concern. He seemed to have heard the conversation from a distance. "Miss Emma," he said softly. "Are you all right?" Emma could only shake her head, tears streaming down her face now, not of sadness, but of an overwhelming, soul-crushing despair. He said I had to marry him." Sam's face was unreadable, but his eyes held a deep sympathy. "Black Jack. He's a hard man. But he's a fair man in his own way. He'll keep his word." Fair, the word again. But what did it mean in a world where a woman's body and future could be used as currency? Emma spent the next week in a daze. She was given a small but clean room on the second floor of the main house. The maids, simple, hard-working women, treated her with a curious mix of respect and apprehension. They knew who she was, and they knew who she was to become. Whispers followed her in the hallways, and she felt like a ghost, a curiosity on display. She tried to busy herself, helping with chores, but her mind was a whirlwind of fear and grief. Every day, the reality of her situation settled deeper into her bones. She was to be the wife of a man she didn't know, a man who saw her as a means to an end. She saw Black Jack a few times during the week. He was always busy, always moving, a whirlwind of command and authority. He would nod curtly to her, but never spoke. He was a distant, unreachable figure, a shadow in her new home. She felt an eerie sense of being watched, an animal trapped in a luxurious cage. The night before the wedding, Emma lay awake in her bed, staring at the ceiling. The sounds of the ranch were a constant symphony outside. The creak of the barn, the distant howl of a coyote, the lowing of cattle. It was the sound of a living, breathing empire, and she was to be its queen, a title she had no desire for. She thought of her father again, of his kind eyes and calloused hands. She wondered if he would be ashamed of her, of the choice she had made. But then she remembered his last words to her before he rode off to meet his fate. "Stay strong, my little Emma. No matter what, you survive. Survival. That's what this was. A grim, desperate, and utterly necessary act of survival. She was not a victim. She was a survivor. This thought, this defiant spark of fire, was the only thing that kept her from shattering completely. She would go through with it. She would be his wife, and she would find a way to live, to thrive, even in the shadow of this man. As the sun began to rise on her wedding day, Emma got up, her movements slow but determined. She looked in the small mirror and saw a stranger looking back at her. Her eyes were older, her face paler, but there was a new, hard glint in them. The girl who cried for her father's debt was gone. In her place was a woman who had just made the most difficult decision of her life and who was now ready to face the consequences, head on. The unspoken vow was now a chilling reality. Her life as Emma Carter, the poor girl, was over. Her life as Mrs. Callahan, the heiress-bearer, was about to begin, and she had no idea what to expect. The wedding was a small, somber affair, held in the main room of the Callahan ranch house. A traveling preacher, a gaunt man with a tired face, stood before a roaring fireplace, his words a monotonous drone that seemed to fade into the background. The witnesses were Blackjack's closest men, grizzled cowboys with hardened faces and hats held respectfully in their hands. They watched the proceedings with a quiet, solemn curiosity, a mix of loyalty to their boss and pity for the young woman standing beside him. Emma wore a simple, unadorned dress, a dark blue that did little to hide the weariness in her eyes. Her hair was pulled back in a tight bun, and her hands, still calloused from farm work, were clenched in front of her. She felt like an actress in a play she had not auditioned for, reciting lines she had no heart for. Blackjack stood beside her, his presence a solid, unyielding wall of muscle and stone. He was dressed in his Sunday best, a dark suit that made him look even more formidable. He had not spoken to her since their fateful meeting. He had not looked at her, not truly. He was as distant and cold as a winter storm. The preacher's words blurred together. Holy matrimony, till death do you part, in sickness and in health. Emma's mind drifted. She wondered what her father would think. He would be furious, of course. He would never have wanted her to sacrifice herself like this. But then, he had made a sacrifice of his own for the land he loved, and she, in her own way, was doing the same. It was a twisted, tragic legacy. When the time came to say, "I do," Emma's voice was a barely audible whisper. Blackjack's was a low, resonant rumble. There was no kiss. The preacher pronounced them man and wife, and the ceremony was over. The men offered a few mumbled congratulations, but there was no celebration, no joy. It was a transaction, a contract. The moment the preacher was paid and had departed, the atmosphere in the room changed. The men relaxed, and a sense of routine returned. Blackjack, with a curt nod to his men, turned to Emma. "We need to discuss arrangements," he said, his voice flat. "This is a marriage of convenience, nothing more. You will be my wife in name and in function when the time comes for an heir. Until then, you will manage the house. The servants will report to you. You will have all you need, but you will not leave the ranch without my permission." His words were like a series of commands, a list of rules for a new employee. Emma felt a pang of humiliation. She was not a person to him. She was a title, a role to be filled. "I understand," she said, her voice firm, a defiant strength she didn't know she possessed. Blackjack's gaze held hers for a brief moment, a flicker of something she couldn't quite place in his cold eyes. "Good. Sam will show you around. You are to be called Mrs. Callahan. Do not forget it." He turned and walked away, a silent dismissal. Emma was left standing alone in a house that was now her own, and yet felt more alien than anything she had ever known. Sam, the kind-faced cowboy, approached her. "Mrs. Callahan?" he said, the title feeling foreign on his tongue. "I'll show you around." He led her through the house, explaining the various rooms and their purposes. The kitchen, a vast space with a cast-iron stove that could feed an army of men. The pantry, stocked with enough provisions to last a year. The sitting room, a comfortable space with a large fireplace and shelves filled with books. Emma was surprised by the library. She had not expected Blackjack to be a man of letters. "He reads a lot," Sam said, as if reading her mind. "Especially late at night. The man never seems to sleep." Emma didn't ask why. She was beginning to understand that Blackjack was a man of solitude and secrets. He showed her the way to her bedroom, a comfortable room with a large four-poster bed and a window that overlooked the vast plains. "This is your room," Sam said. "His is at the other end of the hall." The unspoken words hung in the air. They were married, but they would not share a bed. Not yet, at least. The chilling part of the agreement, the part about bearing heirs, was a future threat, a looming shadow over her life. Emma spent the rest of the day in a state of quiet numbness. She tried to organize the house, to take on the role of Mrs. Callahan, but everything felt unreal. She met the servants, the cook, the maid, the stable hands, and each interaction was a delicate dance of politeness and unspoken tension. They were all kind to her, but she felt their pity and their curiosity. As night fell, Emma found herself in the library looking at the titles on the books. They were mostly history books, accounts of battles and great men. She found a book on farming, a worn copy, and her fingers traced the familiar lines of the cover. This was a piece of her old life, a small comfort in this new, strange world. She heard footsteps and turned to see Blackjack standing in the doorway, his silhouette a dark, powerful shape against the light from the hallway. "You like to read?" he asked, his voice low. "My father taught me," she said, her voice small. "We didn't have many books, but the few we had we read often." He didn't reply. He simply walked to a large leather chair and sat down, opening a book and losing himself in its pages. He was there, and yet he wasn't. He was a silent sentinel in her new life. Emma sat down on the floor by the fireplace, the warmth a welcome comfort against the cold dread in her heart. She watched him, this man who was now her husband. She saw the lines of a hard life etched on his face, the way his eyes moved across the page, a quiet concentration that was almost unsettling. He was not a monster, but he was not a man of warmth or kindness either. He was a man of business, a man of power, and she was now a part of his ledger. As she watched him, she thought of her own role in this strange arrangement. She was meant to be a tool, a vessel, but she was not going to be a ghost in her own life. She would learn. She would adapt. And maybe, just maybe, she would find a way to reclaim a part of herself in this cold, empty marriage. The survival instinct was a fire in her belly, and she would not let it be extinguished. The first week as Mrs. Callahan was a lesson in adaptation. Emma quickly learned the rhythms of the ranch, the bustling energy of the mornings giving way to the quiet of the afternoons, only to surge again with the evening meal. She took on her duties with a grim efficiency, managing the household staff, overseeing the preparation of meals, and ensuring the smooth operation of the domestic side of the Callahan empire. She was surprised to find a sense of purpose in the work. It was familiar in a way. The chores were bigger, the house grander, but the principles were the same as those she had learned on her father's farm. She found comfort in the predictable nature of the tasks, a small anchor in the tumultuous sea of her new life. Yet she was a figure of quiet hostility. The Cowboys, a dozen or so men who lived and worked on the ranch, treated her with a mixture of respect and suspicion. They were loyal to Blackjack, and they saw her as a stranger who had been thrust into their world. They called her Mrs. Callahan, but the title felt like a suit of armor she was not yet comfortable wearing. Emma's greatest challenge was not the work, but the isolation. Blackjack remained a distant, brooding presence. He ate his meals in a silence that was more chilling than any argument. He would sit at the head of the long table, his eyes surveying the room, his jaw set in a permanent line. He rarely looked at her, and when he did, it was a quick, assessing glance. The only person who seemed to treat her with genuine warmth was Sam. The kind-faced cowboy often went out of his way to make her feel at ease, offering her a smile or a word of encouragement. "You're doing a good job, ma'am," he said to her one morning as she was supervising the laundry. "The place has never run smoother." "Thank you, Sam," Emma replied, a genuine smile touching her lips. "It's a lot to learn." Sam leaned against the porch railing, his eyes scanning the horizon. "Folks around here are just used to things being a certain way. Blackjack's a man of habit. This is a new habit for him. They'll come around." "I hope so," Emma said, her gaze drifting toward the corral where Blackjack was overseeing the breaking of a wild stallion. He was a man of power, of raw, untamed energy, and she was a small, fragile thing in his world. The hostility was not just from the Cowboys. There were others who resented her presence. A woman named Clara, a stern-faced housekeeper who had worked for Blackjack for years, treated Emma with undisguised contempt. Clara had run the household before Emma's arrival, and she saw Emma as an interloper, a young upstart who had been given a position she didn't deserve. One afternoon, Emma found Clara rearranging the shelves in the pantry, undoing the work she had just completed. "Clara, I just organized those," Emma said, trying to keep her voice even. "Is there a reason you're moving them?" Clara's lips thinned into a tight line. "I've been organizing this pantry for 15 years, ma'am. I know where things go. This is how Mr. Callahan likes it." The message was clear. This was Blackjack's house, and she was just a temporary fixture. "I am the mistress of this house now, Clara," Emma said, her voice gaining a steely edge. "My decisions stand." Clara's eyes flashed with anger. "The mistress? You think a piece of paper makes you family? You're a stranger, miss, and you'll always be one." The words stung, but Emma stood her ground. "I may be a stranger to you, but I am his wife, and I will have your respect." Clara scoffed and walked away, her back rigid with defiance. The small victory felt hollow. Emma knew she had to establish herself. She was not a guest. She was a partner, however unwillingly. She began to assert her authority, but with a gentle hand. She made small changes: a more varied diet for the Cowboys, a new schedule for chores, little things that made the ranch feel more like a home. The Cowboys, to her surprise, began to appreciate the changes. The meals were better, the routines more efficient. She even tried to make contact with Blackjack. One evening, as he was in his study, she brought him a cup of coffee. He was engrossed in his books, his brow furrowed in concentration. "I brought you some coffee," she said softly, setting the cup on his desk. He looked up, his eyes a flash of surprise. He nodded curtly. "Thank you." She lingered for a moment. "I was wondering. I found a lot of ledgers in the study. My father's farm. Is it a part of the ranch now?" Blackjack closed his book and leaned back in his chair. "It is. It's a small parcel, but the land is good. I'll have men working it in the spring." Will they be able to salvage anything?" she asked, a sliver of hope in her heart. "What's to salvage?" he asked, his voice flat. "The debt is paid. The land is mine. It's done." The finality of his words was like a blow to her gut. She had hoped, foolishly, that a part of her old life could be saved, but he saw it all as a transaction, a simple transfer of ownership. "Right," she said, her voice hollow. She turned to leave. "Emma," he said, and the use of her first name made her freeze. He rarely used it. She turned back. He looked at her, a strange, unreadable expression on his face. This is your home now. Your father's land will be cared for. That much I can promise you." It was not a comfort. It was a cold, hard fact, delivered without a hint of warmth. He was a man of his word, but his words were like stones. He was taking care of her, but it was like a master taking care of his property. She was an investment, and he was protecting his investment. As she left the study, Emma felt the weight of her new reality settle upon her shoulders. She had a home, she had a name, and she had a purpose. But she was not a wife. She was a hostage, a well-kept, well-fed hostage in the heart of a Cowboys empire. The hostility she faced from others was nothing compared to the quiet, suffocating loneliness of her marriage. Emma's days settled into a rigid, solitary routine. She would rise with the sun, supervise the kitchen staff, and spend the rest of the day in a flurry of domestic activity. The work was demanding, but it kept her mind from dwelling on the bleakness of her situation. Her nights were the hardest. She would sit in her room, a book in her hands, listening to the sounds of the night and the silence of the house. Blackjack's presence was a constant, unsettling shadow. He was a ghost in his own home, appearing and disappearing without a word, his movements as silent as a panther's. He never sought her out, never initiated a conversation. He would simply be there, a quiet, powerful force that she was forced to coexist with. One rainy afternoon, as a fierce storm raged outside, Emma was in the study, organizing the books. She found a leather-bound photo album, and a wave of curiosity, mixed with a sense of trepidation, washed over her. She knew she shouldn't, but she couldn't resist. She sat on the floor, the album on her lap, and slowly opened it. The first pages were filled with old, faded photographs of a young Black Jack. He looked younger, happier, his smile a flash of white in a sun-tanned face. He was with a group of friends, all young cowboys, their faces full of laughter and the carefree spirit of youth. Emma found a picture of him with a beautiful young woman, her hair a cascade of red curls, her eyes sparkling with laughter. He was smiling, his arm around her waist, and the look on his face was one of pure, unadulterated love. Emma felt a pang of surprise. This was a side of Black Jack she had never seen. This was a man with a heart, a man capable of love and joy. The man she knew was a statue of stone and ice. As she turned the page, the pictures became more somber. The beautiful woman was no longer smiling. Her eyes held a deep sadness, a quiet desperation. There were pictures of her holding a small baby, her face pale and exhausted. The album ended abruptly with a single picture of the red-haired woman and the baby, their faces blurred with the motion of the camera. The last page was empty. Emma closed the album, her heart heavy with a new understanding. The shadow that haunted Black Jack was not just loneliness, it was a ghost of a past love, a past life. This was the reason for his coldness, for his silence. He had loved once, and that love had ended in tragedy. As she was about to put the album back, a piece of paper fell from between the pages. It was a faded newspaper clipping. The headline was a bold, dark type: "Local rancher's wife and son killed in tragic carriage accident." Emma's breath caught in her throat. The beautiful red-haired woman was his wife. The baby was his son. They were gone. Killed. The tragedy had turned him into the man he was today. His silence, his coldness, his need for an heir. It was all a desperate attempt to fill the void left by his lost family. She heard the door open and looked up to see Black Jack standing there, his eyes fixed on the album in her hands. His face, usually a mask of indifference, was now a storm of emotion, anger, pain, and a raw, vulnerable sadness she had not seen before. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice a low growl. Emma flinched, her hands trembling. I was just organizing the books. I found this. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have looked." He strode over to her, his movements quick and decisive. He snatched the album from her hands and slammed it shut. He looked at her, his eyes blazing with a fury she had never seen. "Some things are best left alone," he said, his voice a dangerous whisper. "You have no right to pry into my past. Your job is to focus on the future, on the heir you are to provide." The words were a brutal slap, a reminder of her place in his life. He was not a grieving widower, a man to be pitied. He was a cold, calculating man who saw her as a tool, and she had just reminded him of the pain that had created him. "I wasn't prying," Emma said, her voice shaking. I saw her. Your wife. She was beautiful." The mention of his deceased wife seemed to hit a nerve. He turned away, his shoulders slumped in a way she had never seen before. He was not a man of granite now. He was a man of bone and muscle, burdened by a pain so deep it had calcified his heart. He took a deep breath, and when he turned back to her, the mask of indifference was back in place. "That part of my life is over. It is gone. And so is the man I was then. The man you see now is all that's left. Do not forget it." He walked out of the study, leaving her alone in the silent room. Emma sat there for a long time, the cold weight of the album in her hands. She had looked into the abyss of his soul, and she had seen a void, a bottomless pit of grief. She had found the ghost that haunted him, and she knew with a chilling certainty that this man, this stranger, was a man broken by his past, a man who would never love again. And she was bound to him, a wife in a ghost-haunted house. The incident with the photo album created an unspoken tension between Emma and Black Jack. He was even more withdrawn than before, and she was careful to avoid his study and any other space where she might intrude upon his solitude. The ghost of his past had become a palpable presence in the house, a silent third party in their strange marriage. Emma found solace in the daily routine, in the small acts of kindness she could offer to the men on the ranch. She would often bring them coffee or a fresh-baked pie, a gesture that was met with quiet gratitude. The cowboys who had been wary of her began to warm to her. They saw her as a woman of quiet strength, a resilient presence in a house ruled by a man of stone. One afternoon, Emma was walking back from the stables when she saw Sam struggling with a stubborn horse. The animal, a magnificent stallion, was a feisty creature, and it was clear that it was giving the cowboy a hard time. "Need a hand, Sam?" Emma asked, her voice calm. Sam looked at her, a look of surprise on his face. "This one's a fighter, Mrs. Callahan. Better to stay clear." Emma approached the horse slowly, her movements deliberate and non-threatening. She had a way with animals, a gentle touch and a calm voice that seemed to soothe even the wildest creatures. She had learned it from her father, who believed that a horse was a partner, not a tool. "What's his name?" she asked. "Storm," Sam said with a wry grin, "and he's living up to it." Emma reached out a hand, and the stallion flinched, its ears flicking back in a show of defiance. She didn't press. She just stood there, her hand outstretched, her eyes meeting its. After a moment, the horse seemed to sense her calm energy. It snorted, and then hesitantly it nudged her hand. Emma stroked its neck, a soft, soothing touch that seemed to melt the stallion's resistance. Sam watched in amazement. "How did you do that?" "He's not a fighter, Sam," Emma said, her eyes still on the horse. "He's just scared. He needs a gentle hand, not a heavy one." She took the reins from Sam and led the horse back to its stall, the stallion following her like a dog. Blackjack, who had been watching the scene from a distance, walked over. He had a look of surprise on his face, a rare emotion for him. "You have a way with horses," he said, his voice a low rumble. "My father taught me," Emma replied, her voice firm. "He said a horse knows when you're a friend, and it knows when you're afraid." Blackjack's eyes held hers, a brief, unreadable moment of shared understanding. He saw in her a part of her father, the part that had been an honest, hard-working man. He saw a woman who was not afraid, not of the animal and perhaps not of him. "We have a problem with a few of the younger stallions," Blackjack said, his voice hesitant, as if the words were difficult to say. "They're wild. Won't let anyone near them. We've had a few men get injured." He was asking for her help. The realization was a shock. This man, who saw her as a tool, was now acknowledging a skill she possessed. He was, in a strange way, showing a flicker of respect. "I can help," Emma said, a small sense of triumph in her heart. She began spending her afternoons in the corrals, working with the wild horses. She used no force, no heavy hand. She used patience, a calm voice, and a gentle touch. She would talk to them, sing to them, and slowly, surely she would win their trust. Blackjack would often watch her from a distance, a silent, brooding observer. He saw the way she handled the horses, the way she calmed them with her quiet strength. He saw a woman who was more than just a means to an end. He saw a partner. One evening, he came to her as she was finishing her work, the scent of hay and horse sweat clinging to her clothes. "You've tamed 3 of them," he said, his voice tinged with a hint of admiration. "No one else could do that." "They're not tamed, sir," Emma corrected, her voice soft but firm. "They're just learning to trust. It's a different thing." Blackjack nodded slowly. He understood the difference. He knew the difference between a broken spirit and a willing partnership. He had been trying to break her, to force her to be his wife. But she, like the horses, was learning to trust, not because she was forced, but because she had chosen to. "I am a man who has broken many things in my life," he said, his voice a low, confessional tone. "But I have never been able to build trust." Emma looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw the deep, lonely sadness in his eyes. He was a man who had built an empire, but who was surrounded by walls he had built himself. He was a man of power, but he was utterly alone. "Trust is earned," she said softly. "It is not given, and it is not bought." Blackjack looked away, the moment of vulnerability gone as quickly as it had appeared, but the unspoken truth was there, hanging in the air between them. They were not just 2 people in a marriage of convenience. They were 2 broken souls, a man haunted by his past, and a woman trying to build a future from the ashes of her own. And in the quiet of the setting sun, in the dust of the corral, an unspoken trust was beginning to form, a fragile, tentative bridge between two solitary islands. The tentative truce between Emma and Black Jack was a fragile thing, and it was about to be shattered. One afternoon, as Emma was in the main room organizing some ledgers, a group of cowboys burst in, their faces grim and their movements agitated. "Mr. Callahan, we have a problem," one of them, a young man named Tom, said, his voice filled with urgency. Black Jack, who was in his study, came out, his face a mask of authority. "What is it?" "The Brandons," Tom said, his voice laced with venom. "They're rustling our cattle from the north pasture. Sam saw them. They're trying to take a whole herd." The Brandons. Emma knew the name. They were a family of ranchers who had long been rivals of the Callahans. They were known for their greed and their ruthless tactics. Black Jack's face hardened, his eyes turning to cold steel. "Get the men," he commanded. "We ride out now." Emma felt a shiver of fear. This was the dark side of the West, the lawlessness and the violence that had taken her father's life. She knew what this meant. It wasn't just a dispute, it was a confrontation, and it would likely end in bloodshed. As the men were gathering their rifles and saddling their horses, Emma went to Black Jack. "You're going after them, now?" she asked, her voice filled with apprehension. "It's a matter of principle," he said, his voice a low growl. "They can't get away with this." "But it's dangerous," she insisted. "They're a gang of ruthless men. You can't just ride in there alone." He scoffed. "I won't be alone, and I am a man who does not back down. My reputation is what keeps this empire intact. If I let them get away with this, they'll be back for more." She knew he was right. In this world, a show of weakness was a death sentence, but the thought of him riding into a gunfight, of him being hurt, filled her with a strange, protective fear. It was an emotion she didn't expect to feel for him. "Please be careful," she said, her voice soft. He looked at her, a brief flash of surprise in his eyes. He didn't respond, just turned and walked away, a man of purpose and unyielding will. He was a force of nature, and she was a small, insignificant part of his world. Emma watched from the porch as the men rode out, a cloud of dust and determination. She felt a profound sense of helplessness. Her world had changed, but the dangers of the West remained the same. She went back inside, her heart a heavy, anxious beat in her chest. The hours that followed were an agonizing wait. Emma tried to busy herself, but she couldn't focus. Every distant sound, every gust of wind, made her jump. The silence of the house was a deafening roar. Finally, as the sun was beginning to set, she heard the sound of hooves. She ran to the door and saw the men returning. They were tired, their clothes dusty, and their faces grim. Her eyes scanned the group, searching for him. She found him at the front of the group, his hat pulled low, his face a mask of grim satisfaction. But as he dismounted, she saw the dark, spreading stain on his arm. "Black Jack!" she cried, rushing toward him. He winced as he got off his horse, his face contorting in pain. "It's nothing," he said, his voice low. "Just a scratch." But it was more than a scratch. A bullet had grazed his arm, and the wound was deep and bloody. "We got the cattle back," Sam said, his voice grim. "But we had a fight. A few men got hurt. And Black Jack, he took a hit." Emma, her fear giving way to a fierce, protective anger, turned on Black Jack. "A scratch? Are you insane? You're bleeding," she said, her voice filled with a mixture of relief and fury. He winced again. "It's fine, Emma. I've had worse." "Well, you won't be having worse on my watch," she said, her voice firm. "Inside, now." He looked at her, a flash of surprise in his eyes at her commanding tone. He was used to giving orders, not taking them, but he didn't argue. He allowed her to lead him inside, his body stiff with pain. She sat him down in the main room and went to fetch the medical supplies. When she returned, she found him trying to clean the wound himself, his face pale with the effort. "Don't," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "Let me." She knelt beside him, her hand steady as she cleaned the wound. The bullet had torn a deep gash in his arm, and she could see the raw red flesh. She worked carefully, her touch light, her mind focused on the task at hand. Blackjack watched her, his eyes following her every move. He saw the way her brow furrowed in concentration, the way her hands, though small, were strong and sure. He had never had anyone take care of him like this. He had always been the one in charge, the one who took care of others. "You're a doctor?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. "No," she said, not looking up. "My father and we had to take care of ourselves. I've patched up enough cuts and scrapes to know what I'm doing." She finished cleaning the wound and began to wrap it in a clean bandage. He winced but didn't complain. "That was a fool's errand," she said, her voice filled with a quiet anger. "You could have been killed. For what? A few cows?" "It wasn't about the cows," he said, his voice low. "It was about respect, about honor. A man's reputation is everything in this world." "And what good is a reputation if you're dead?" she shot back. He didn't reply. He just looked at her, a strange, unreadable expression on his face. He saw her not as a wife of convenience, not as a means to an end, but as a woman who was capable of care and concern, a woman who had just defied him and won. The confrontation had changed something between them. The rigid wall of silence was gone, replaced by a fragile understanding. He was a man of power and pride, but he was also a man who was vulnerable, who could be hurt. And she was a woman who was not afraid to challenge him, who saw beyond the cold exterior to the man underneath. In the quiet of the room, as the bandage was wrapped around his arm, a new kind of bond was being forged, a bond born of shared vulnerability and a nascent unspoken trust. Emma spent the next few days in a state of quiet concern. Blackjack was a difficult patient. He was restless, impatient, and hated being confined to the house. His wound, though not life-threatening, was deep and painful, and she had to change the dressing every day, a process that was both intimate and awkward. During these moments, a strange intimacy grew between them. The usual silence was broken by the quiet sounds of their interaction, the rustle of the bandage, the soft intake of his breath as she cleaned the wound, her gentle humming as she worked. He would watch her, his eyes following her every move, a silent observer in a world he had always controlled. One afternoon, as she was changing the dressing, he spoke, his voice a low rumble. "My pa, he was a hard man," he said, the words coming out as a sudden confession. He believed that a man's strength was all he had, that weakness was for the soft. Emma didn't stop her work. "He taught you well," she said softly. "He taught me how to fight," Blackjack said, a touch of bitterness in his voice. "But he never taught me how to live, to be a man and not just a machine." Emma looked up at him, a flicker of understanding in her eyes. "He built you into a fortress," she said. "But what's the point of a fortress if you're alone inside it?" He didn't reply, but his gaze held hers, a brief, vulnerable moment of shared understanding. He was a man who had built an empire, but who was haunted by the very principles that had made him. He was a product of his past, a man who had never learned to be anything other than what he had been taught. The silence returned, but it was no longer a wall between them. It was a space where unspoken truths could exist. Later that week, as Blackjack's wound was beginning to heal, he asked her to join him in the study. She found him sitting in his usual leather chair, a book in his hand. He gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit," he said. Emma sat down, her heart thumping in her chest. She had never been invited into his world like this before. "I have something to show you," he said, his voice low. He put down his book and reached into a locked drawer in his desk, pulling out a small, worn leather pouch. He opened it and pulled out a single, small, silver locket. He held it out to her. "This was my mother's." Emma took it, her fingers tracing the intricate carvings on the silver. It was a beautiful, delicate piece, so out of place in this harsh male world. She opened it and saw two faded pictures inside. One was of a young, kind-faced woman with a gentle smile. The other was of a young boy no older than 6, his eyes bright and full of life. It was Blackjack, as a child. "She was a good woman," he said, his voice a whisper. "She taught me how to read." She taught me that there was more to life than just fighting and land. She taught me about caring for things. He looked at the locket, a distant sadness in his eyes. When she died, I lost more than just my mother. I lost the only person who ever saw me as anything other than my father's son. Emma's heart went out to him. She saw the little boy in the picture, a boy who had lost his mother, a boy who had been left to face the world alone. She saw the source of his pain, the root of his coldness. He was not a monster. He was a little boy who had never learned how to mourn. "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice filled with genuine empathy. He nodded, a curt, self-conscious gesture. He took the locket from her and put it back in the pouch, locking it away. The moment of vulnerability was over. The fortress was rebuilt. "I wanted you to understand," he said, his voice returning to its usual flat tone. "I am who I am because of my past. My love for my first wife. It was a good thing, a pure thing, but it made me weak, and it got her killed." Emma's mind reeled. He blamed himself for his first wife's death. He had not just lost her, he had lost the belief that love could exist in this world. The need for an heir, for a legacy, was not a cold, calculated decision. It was a desperate attempt to create a future that he could control, a future that would not be filled with the same kind of loss that had broken him. "Love is not a weakness," Emma said softly, her voice filled with conviction. "It's a strength. It's the only thing that makes this life bearable." He looked at her, a flicker of something she couldn't place in his eyes. He didn't reply, just stood up and walked to the window, his back to her. The conversation was over. But something had changed. She had seen a part of him that no one else had seen. She had seen the cowboy's secret. And in that moment, she understood him, not as a husband, not as a master, but as a man who was broken, but who was in his own way, trying to find a way to heal. As the days turned into weeks, Emma settled into her new life with a quiet grace that surprised everyone, including herself. She had a purpose now, a home to run and a man to care for, even if that care was unspoken and often rebuffed. The coldness between her and Black Jack began to thaw slowly, imperceptibly, like the first days of spring after a long, harsh winter. The shared moments were fleeting and few, but they were there. A nod of thanks when she brought him his coffee, a brief moment of eye contact as she passed him in the hallway, a flicker of a smile when she made a witty remark. He was still a man of few words, but the silence between them was no longer a wall, but a comfortable space of shared existence. The Cowboys, too, had begun to accept her. They saw her as one of them, a woman of the West, who knew how to work hard and was not afraid of a challenge. Clara, the stern housekeeper, had even softened, a silent nod of respect passing between them. The seasons changed, and the first signs of spring began to appear. The air was no longer cold and dry, but warm and filled with the scent of new life. Emma spent her days in the gardens, planting flowers and vegetables, her hands in the rich soil she had come to call home. She found a deep sense of peace in the work, a connection to the land that had been her father's, and was now, in a strange, complicated way, her own. Black Jack would often watch her from the porch from the barn, a silent, brooding presence. He saw the way she nurtured the land, the way she made things grow. He saw a woman who was not just surviving, but thriving. One evening, as she was coming in from the garden, her clothes stained with dirt, he stopped her. "The place, it looks different," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Better." Emma smiled, a genuine, radiant smile that made her face light up. "It just needed a woman's touch, I suppose." He didn't reply, but his eyes held hers for a long moment, a new, unreadable emotion in their depths. It was not a look of calculation or control, but something akin to appreciation. Their lives continued in this new, unspoken rhythm. The days were a flurry of activity, and the nights were a quiet, companionable solitude. They would sit in the study, him with his book, her with her sewing, the only sound the crackle of the fire and the distant howl of a coyote. They were two solitary islands no longer separated by a vast ocean, but by a quiet, flowing river. One morning, Emma woke up with a feeling she hadn't felt in a long time, a strange lightness in her stomach, a dizzying sense of something new. She was late for her chores and she felt a wave of nausea. She ran to the washroom, her head spinning. The feeling was familiar, a feeling she had only read about in books but knew instinctively. She sat on the floor, her hands trembling. It was a feeling of dread but also of a strange, fragile hope. Later that day, she found a moment alone and took a small piece of cloth, dipping it into a mixture of water and ash, an old trick her father had taught her to test for pregnancy. The result was a faint, yet unmistakable change in color. Emma's heart was a drum in her chest. A new life. A new life was growing inside of her. Black Jack's heir, the purpose for which she had been brought here. The chilling part of the deal was no longer a future threat, but a present reality. She stood there, a strange mix of emotions raging within her. Fear for the unknown, for the child she was to carry. Sadness for the life she had lost and the life she was now living. But also a fragile, trembling hope. This was not just Black Jack's heir. This was her child. A new life, a new beginning, a new chance to build a family, even in the shadow of a ghost-haunted house. She knew she had to tell him, but she didn't know how. How do you tell a man who sees you as a means to an end that his heir is on the way? How do you tell a man of stone that his fortress is about to be filled with the sound of a child's laughter? That evening, she found him in his study, a book in his hand. She stood in the doorway, her hands clasped tightly, her voice a fragile whisper. "Black Jack," she said. He looked up, a question in his eyes. I have something to tell you." She took a deep breath, the words a difficult, painful confession. "The deal we made, it's happening. I am with child." The words hung in the air, a profound silence filling the room. Black Jack's face, usually a mask of indifference, was now unreadable. His eyes, those stormy, unreadable eyes, held hers. The past had broken him, the present was a fragile truce, and now the future was about to change everything. The news of Emma's pregnancy hung in the air, a silent, powerful force that seemed to absorb all other sounds. Black Jack's face, a fortress of impassive stone, did not betray a single emotion. He stood there, frozen in time, a man who had built his life on control, now faced with the most uncontrollable force of all. A new life. Emma watched him, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She had braced herself for many reactions, anger, indifference, a cold, calculated nod of approval, but the complete stillness that settled over him was far more unsettling. He was a man of action, of decisive movements, and this lack of reaction was a void she couldn't understand. Finally he spoke, his voice a low, almost guttural sound. "You're sure?" "Yes," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I am. I've been feeling it for a few weeks now." He turned away from her, walking to the window, his back a rigid line of silent contemplation. She wanted to say something, to fill the deafening silence, but she couldn't. She could only watch him, a small, frightened woman in a room with a giant. After what felt like an eternity, he turned back to her, his face a new, unfamiliar mask of quiet solemnity. "This changes things," he said. Emma's mind raced. What did it change? Would he keep her? Would he cast her out now that her purpose was fulfilled? What do you mean?" she asked, her voice a fragile thing. "It means you are no longer a temporary fixture," he said, his eyes meeting hers, a rare, direct gaze. "You are the mother of my child. You will be safe. You will be protected." The words were not a promise of love or happiness, but a vow of protection, a grim, powerful promise from a man who had lost everything. He was a man who had failed to protect his first family, and he would not fail again. This new life was not just an heir, it was a second chance at a legacy, a second chance at redemption. He walked over to her, and for the first time he reached out and touched her. His hand, calloused and strong, rested on her stomach, a feather-light touch that sent a shiver through her. It was not a gesture of love, but one of profound acknowledgement. "The doctor will come tomorrow," he said, his voice softer now. "You will have all you need. You will not want for anything." And then he was gone, leaving her alone in the room, her hand still tingling from his touch. Emma stood there, a whirlwind of emotions swirling within her. She was a mother now, and she was under the protection of a man who saw her not as a wife, but as a vessel for his legacy, a promise of a future he had almost lost forever. The news spread through the ranch with the speed of a wildfire. The Cowboys, who had been cautious with her, were now openly respectful. They saw the change in Black Jack, the subtle softening of his hardened exterior. He was still a man of few words, but his orders were now tinged with a new sense of urgency, a new sense of purpose. Clara, the stern housekeeper, had been the most vocal. She came to Emma, her face a rare mixture of tears and a wide smile. "A baby," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "A little one in this big empty house. It's a miracle, ma'am." Clara took Emma under her wing, her previously icy demeanor replaced by a motherly protectiveness. She brought Emma special teas, made sure she was well fed, and fussed over her constantly. Emma saw in her a woman who had seen the tragedy of Black Jack's past and who now saw in her pregnancy a chance for a new beginning for them all. Black Jack, for his part, became a silent, watchful presence. He would bring her a cup of tea in the mornings, a gesture so uncharacteristic that it took her breath away. He would sit with her in the evenings, not speaking, but simply being there, a solid, reassuring presence. One evening, as they were sitting in the study, a silence of companionship between them, Emma spoke. "Did you love her?" she asked, her voice soft. "Your first wife?" He looked up from his book, his eyes a distant, sad grey. "More than anything, she was my light, Emma, the only person who saw me as more than just Black Jack Callahan, the rancher." She saw John. The name felt foreign on her tongue. John. She had never heard anyone call him that. It was a name for a man, not for an empire. "She gave me a son," he said, his voice a low, painful whisper. He had her eyes. He had her laugh. He was everything. The pain in his voice was raw and real. He was not a man of stone, but a man who had built a wall around his heart to protect it from the pain of a loss so profound it had almost destroyed him. "You were afraid of love because of what happened," Emma said, her voice filled with a quiet understanding. He nodded slowly, a ghost of a smile on his lips. I was afraid to feel anything ever again. But you brought a warmth to this house that I had forgotten. And now you're bringing a new life." He looked at her, his eyes holding a new, deeper emotion. It was not love, not yet, but it was something more profound. It was trust. It was an unspoken gratitude. It was the first sign that the walls he had built were beginning to crumble. The cowboy's heart was not a fortress, but a fragile, wounded thing, and she, a poor girl from a small farm, was slowly, imperceptibly healing it. Emma's pregnancy progressed with a quiet sense of purpose. The mornings were filled with a gentle nausea, and the days were a mixture of domestic work and quiet contemplation. She would often walk through the fields, a sense of peace settling over her as she felt the soft movements of the new life within her. Black Jack, true to his word, had the best doctor in the county visit the ranch. The doctor, a kind and gentle man, assured them that Emma was strong and healthy. The news was met with a grim satisfaction from Black Jack. He had his promise, and he would do everything in his power to keep it. The ranch, once a place of quiet, masculine order, was now filled with a new, feminine energy. Emma had begun to decorate the nursery, a small room at the end of the hall. She filled it with soft blankets and hand-sewn quilts, the colors a mixture of warm yellows and soft blues. She was not just preparing for a baby, she was preparing for a future she had never thought possible. But the peace was not meant to last. One afternoon, as Emma was in the garden, Sam rode up, his face grim. "Mrs. Callahan, you should come inside," he said, his voice low with urgency. "We have company." Emma looked up and saw a rider approaching, a lone figure silhouetted against the setting sun. As the man got closer, she saw the grim set of his jaw, the cold look in his eyes. He was not a friend. The man dismounted, his boots kicking up a small cloud of dust. He was dressed in a dark suit, his face a hard, weathered mask. "I'm here to see John Callahan," he said, his voice a cold rasp. Blackjack emerged from the house, his eyes narrowing as he recognized the man. "What do you want, Brandon?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. The man, a Brandon, was a rival rancher, a ruthless man known for his underhanded dealings. This was the same family that had been rustling their cattle. "I've come for what's mine, Callahan," Brandon said, a sneer on his lips. "I hear you have a wife now, a young one, a fine prize." Emma felt a chill of fear. He was not just here for a land dispute, he was here to cause trouble, he was here for her. Blackjack stepped forward, a menacing presence. "She is my wife, Brandon. You have no business here. I suggest you get back on your horse and ride away before you lose more than just a few cows." Brandon's sneer widened. "Is that a threat or a plea? I heard your men had to carry you back from our last little spat." The great Blackjack Callahan, brought low by a woman's whimpering. The insult was a low blow, and Emma saw the muscle in Blackjack's jaw clench. She knew he was a man who lived by his reputation, and Brandon was trying to chip away at it, to weaken him. "You have one more chance to leave, Brandon," Blackjack said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. Brandon laughed, a short, bitter sound. "I'm not leaving without what I came for. The land, the cattle, and the woman. My family was here before yours, Callahan. We have a claim to this territory, and we're not going to let a half-breed cowboy and his little tramp of a wife stand in our way." The racial slur, a venomous, cruel word, hit Blackjack like a physical blow. Emma saw the pain in his eyes, a brief, vulnerable flicker before it was replaced by a cold, murderous fury. He was a man who had faced down gunmen and outlaws, but this insult was personal, a wound that went deeper than any bullet. Blackjack took a step forward, his hand resting on the holster of his gun. But before he could act, Emma stepped forward, her voice surprisingly strong. "My husband is no half-breed," she said, her voice filled with a quiet dignity. "He is a man of honor and strength, and this is his land. You are trespassing. Get out." Brandon's eyes, filled with contempt, shifted to her. "You have a lot of fight in you, little girl, but you're in over your head. This isn't a game. This is the West. And women like you don't survive here." He turned to Blackjack, a challenge in his eyes. "You want to settle this like men, Callahan. One-on-one, a duel at dawn. The winner takes it all, the land, the herds, the woman." The proposition was a trap. A duel with a man like Brandon was a death sentence. He was a known killer, a man who fought dirty. Emma's heart pounded in her chest. She knew Blackjack's pride would not allow him to back down. "Fine," Blackjack said, his voice a cold final word. "Dawn, the Northfield, be there." Brandon's sneer was a victory. He tipped his hat in a mockery of a gentleman's gesture and rode away, leaving behind a silence that was more chilling than any sound. Emma's hands were shaking. She turned to Blackjack, her face pale with fear. "You can't do this," she said, her voice raw. "He'll kill you. He's a killer." Blackjack's eyes were distant, his mind already on the fight. "I have no choice, Emma. He challenged my honor, my reputation. If I back down, I lose everything. My men, my land, everything I've worked for. I won't let a coward like him win." "But what about our baby?" she cried, her voice filled with a desperate plea. "What about our future? It's not worth it, Blackjack. Nothing is worth it if you're not here to see it." He looked at her, his eyes softening for a brief, fleeting moment. He saw her fear, her concern, her raw, vulnerable love for him and their unborn child. But his mind was already in the fight. He was a man of the West, a man of honor and duty, and there was no turning back. "I will be here, Emma," he said, his voice a low, firm promise. "I will be here to see our child. I will not lose again, I promise you that." But as he walked away, a man preparing for a fight he knew he had to win, Emma's heart sank. She had seen the look in Brandon's eyes. It was a look of pure hatred. He was not just here to win, he was here to destroy, and she was powerless to stop it. The fragile peace was gone, replaced by the grim reality of a world that was unforgiving and cruel. The night was a long, agonizing blur. Emma couldn't sleep. She sat in the study, a candle flickering on the desk, the only sound the ticking of a grandfather clock. She thought of her father, of his final moments, of the debt that had brought her to this place. She thought of Blackjack, a man she had come to know, to respect and to care for more than she ever thought possible. She went to his study and saw him sitting there, cleaning his gun. He was calm, his movements deliberate, his face a mask of quiet concentration. He was a man at peace with his decision, a man who had accepted his fate. "You should get some sleep," he said, not looking up. "I can't," she said, her voice trembling. "I'm so scared." He looked up at her, his eyes holding a new, rare vulnerability. He saw her fear, and it seemed to touch him in a way her tears couldn't. "I won't lose, Emma," he said, his voice a low, firm promise. "I won't let them take anything else from me, not the land, not the legacy, not you." He was not just fighting for his honor. He was fighting for a future he had never allowed himself to believe in. He was fighting for her, for their child, for the fragile new life they were building. Emma left him to his solitude and went back to her room. She knelt by the window, the cold night air a sharp contrast to the fire in her heart. She prayed. She prayed to a God she hadn't spoken to since her mother died. She prayed for him, for his safety, for his life. She prayed for a miracle. As the sun began to rise, a crimson and gold spectacle on the horizon, Emma watched from the window. She saw the men, a grim procession, ride out to the north field. Blackjack at the front, his head held high, his silhouette a powerful, unyielding shape against the rising sun. She saw Brandon and his men waiting, a dark, menacing group. The two men stood opposite each other, 100 feet apart, the space between them a battlefield. The air was thick with tension, a silence that was more terrifying than any sound. She heard the words of the duelists, the code of the West. At the count of 3. The words were a slow, deliberate death march. 1. Emma closed her eyes, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She was a woman in a man's world, powerless to stop the violence that was a part of its very fabric. 2. She thought of her father, of the blood on the barn door. She thought of the life she had lost and the life she was carrying. 3. She heard the sound of gunfire, a series of quick, brutal explosions that seemed to tear the air apart. She flinched, her body tensing, her mind screaming. She didn't dare open her eyes. She couldn't bear to see the sight that awaited her. After a long, agonizing moment, she heard the sound of a voice, a shout of triumph, and then the sound of hooves riding away, the sound of defeat. She opened her eyes, her hands shaking, and looked out the window. She saw him. Blackjack was standing there, his head held high, his body uninjured. He was a survivor. He had won. A wave of relief so powerful it almost knocked her off her feet washed over her. He was alive. He was safe. He was here. She ran out of the house, her feet bare on the cold wooden floor, her heart filled with a profound gratitude. She reached him as he was dismounting his horse, his face grim but victorious. "You're alive," she said, her voice a sob of relief. He looked at her, his eyes soft with a new, powerful emotion. "I told you I would be here," he said, his voice a low, gentle rumble. "I told you I wouldn't lose again." He wrapped his arms around her, a protective embrace that felt more intimate than any touch she had ever known. He held her, a silent, powerful acknowledgement of their shared reality. He had faced down his enemy and won. He had secured his legacy, his land, his future. But more than that, he had chosen her. He had chosen their future. He had chosen to live. The Cowboys, a silent, grim procession, had returned. They saw their boss, their leader, holding his wife, a small pregnant woman, in his arms, and they understood. The duel was not just about land and honor. It was about a man who had found something worth fighting for. And as they watched, a new kind of respect, a quiet, deep respect, was forged in their hearts. The poor girl had cried for her father's loan, but she had saved a man's soul, and in the process, she had found a family of her own. The days that followed the duel were a period of quiet recovery and change. Blackjack, despite his victory, was more somber than before. The encounter with Brandon, the memory of his first wife and son, had stirred up old ghosts. He was a man who had been pushed to his limits and had come out on the other side, but the experience had left a deep, profound mark on him. Emma, for her part, was a silent and constant presence. She would sit with him in the evenings, not speaking but simply being there. She would bring him his favorite foods, make sure he was comfortable, and watch over him with a quiet, maternal concern. She saw him not as Black Jack Callahan, the powerful rancher, but as John, a man who had been hurt and was trying to heal. One afternoon, as she was in the main room organizing some paperwork, she heard a sound from the study. She went to the door and saw him sitting in his chair, his head in his hands, his body racked with a silent grief. He was not crying, not outwardly, but she could see the raw, exposed vulnerability of his soul. She walked into the room, her movements soft and deliberate. She sat down on the floor beside his chair, her hand resting on his knee. He flinched at her touch, a physical reaction to a touch he was not used to, but he didn't pull away. "You're not a machine, you know," she said, her voice a gentle whisper. "It's okay to feel, it's okay to mourn." He looked at her, his eyes red and raw. "I failed them, Emma," he said, his voice a broken thing. "I wasn't there. I wasn't there to save them. And now I have you, and the baby, and I can't let anything happen to you. I can't lose again." His voice was a confession, a testament to the deep, profound fear that haunted him. He was not just a man of honor. He was a man of immense, soul-crushing loss. "You won't lose us," Emma said, her voice filled with a fierce, protective love, "because you're not a boy who has to fight for everything. You're a man who has learned to trust. You have a family now, John. We are your family." The use of his first name, the simple act of calling him by a name only his mother and first wife had used, seemed to break the last of his defenses. A tear, a single solitary tear, tracked a path down his weathered cheek. He reached out and took her hand, his strong, calloused fingers wrapping around her smaller, softer ones. It was not a gesture of love, but a gesture of need. He was not a cowboy, not a rancher. He was just a man in pain, and she was the only one who could see it. "I don't know how to be gentle," he said, his voice a low, painful confession. "I don't know how to be a father, a husband. All I know is how to fight, how to build, how to survive." "You don't need to be a fighter anymore, John," Emma said, her voice filled with a quiet, profound conviction. "You just need to be here, with us. The rest, we'll figure out together." He squeezed her hand, a silent, powerful acknowledgement. He was a man who had built a life on a foundation of pain and loss, and she, a young woman who had lost everything, was slowly, imperceptibly, teaching him how to build a new one. A life built not on strength and power, but on trust and love. The next few weeks were filled with a quiet, palpable warmth. Black Jack began to spend more time with Emma. He would sit with her in the garden as she worked, asking her questions about her life, about her dreams, about the small things that made her happy. He would read to her in the evenings, his voice a low, comforting rumble that filled the quiet of the house. He was still a man of few words, but every word he spoke now was filled with a new, quiet sincerity. He was no longer just a rancher. He was a husband, a father-to-be, a man who was slowly, gently learning how to love. One evening, as they were sitting by the fireplace, the rain a soft patter against the window, he spoke, his voice so low she almost didn't hear him. "Thank you, Emma," he said, "for not being afraid, for not running away, for staying." She looked at him, her heart filled with a love she had not expected to find. "I had nowhere to go, John," she said, a small, mischievous smile on her lips. "And besides, you're not so bad, for a half-breed cowboy." A rare, full-throated laugh erupted from him, a sound so full of warmth and joy that it took her breath away. The sound of a man who was no longer just surviving but finally truly living. The cowboy was learning how to be gentle, and in the process he was becoming a man she could truly love. As Emma's pregnancy advanced, the house, once a bastion of masculine austerity, began to transform. The walls, once bare, were now adorned with hand-stitched quilts and woven hangings. The air, once filled with the scent of tobacco and leather, now smelled of fresh bread and simmering stews. It was no longer just Black Jack's house, it was their home. Emma found a sense of joy in the small preparations for the baby. She and Clara, now a true ally, would spend hours sewing and knitting, their voices a soft, comfortable hum in the quiet of the afternoons. They would talk about everything and nothing, about the baby's future, about the changing seasons, about the gossip of the county. Black Jack, for his part, was a silent and watchful presence. He would often come into the nursery and stand there, his hands in his pockets, his eyes a mixture of awe and apprehension. He would touch the soft blankets, run his fingers over the tiny hats, his face a new, unfamiliar mask of quiet wonder. He was a man who had built his life on a foundation of hard, brutal realities, and this small, soft world was a new, frightening and beautiful thing to him. One afternoon, Emma found him sitting in the nursery, a small hand-carved rocking horse in his hands. He was looking at it, his face a silent, pensive canvas. "It was my pa's," he said, his voice low. "He made it for me. I was a child then. My world was so much simpler, so much happier." He looked at her, his eyes holding a new, vulnerable emotion. "I want that for our child, Emma. A happy world, a world without all this." He gestured to the vast, unforgiving landscape outside, the world he had fought and bled for. "They will have that, John," Emma said, her voice soft. "We will make sure of it. This is not just a ranch, it's a home, and we're a family." He nodded, a brief, silent acknowledgement. He put the rocking horse down and reached for her hand, his fingers wrapping around hers. He held it for a long moment, a silent, powerful gesture of connection. The doctor, during his monthly visit, confirmed that Emma was in good health and the baby was growing strong. The news was a quiet celebration. Black Jack, upon hearing the news, gave a rare, genuine smile. It was a smile that transformed his entire face, a flash of warmth and light in a man who had been a creature of shadow for so long. One evening, as they were sitting by the fireplace, Emma began to feel a rhythmic, powerful kick. She gasped, a small sound of surprise and joy. Black Jack looked at her, his face a question. "What is it?" "The baby," she said, her voice filled with a quiet wonder. "It's kicking." He looked at her stomach, his eyes wide with a profound curiosity. Can I?" he asked, his voice hesitant. Emma took his hand, his large, powerful hand, and placed it on her stomach. He flinched at the soft, undeniable kick, a jolt of new life against his palm. He sat there, his eyes wide, a sense of awe and wonder on his face. He was not just a rancher, not just a man of power. He was a father, a man who was about to bring a new life into the world, a life he had been afraid to hope for. The kick was a powerful, undeniable connection, a physical bond that transcended all the unspoken words, all the silent rules, all the past pain. It was a glimpse of the future, a future filled with the sound of a child's laughter, a future filled with a love he had never thought he would have again. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a new, powerful emotion. It was not love, not yet, but it was a deep, profound gratitude. He was not just a man who had a wife to bear him heirs. He was a man who was about to become a father, a man who was no longer alone. And in the quiet of the evening, in the warmth of the fireplace, a new, fragile kind of love was beginning to grow. The quiet peace of the ranch was not meant to last. The victory over Brandon had secured Black Jack's reputation, but it had not eliminated his enemies. The West was a place of endless conflict, and as soon as one threat was neutralized, another one appeared. One morning, Sam rode in from the north pasture, his face a mask of concern. "John, we have a problem," he said, his voice low. "The Brandons, they're back, and they've got a lot of men with them. They're not here for a fight. They're here for something else." Black Jack's face hardened, his eyes turning to cold steel. "What do they want?" "They say they have a message for you," Sam said. "From their boss. He wants to talk. He says it's about your father's debt." Emma, who had been listening, felt a cold dread wash over her. Her father's debt, the ghost of the past. It had returned not as a memory, but as a living, breathing threat. Black Jack's jaw was set in a hard line. "I have no debt. It was paid. It was settled." "They say it wasn't paid to the right man," Sam said. "They say they're the new owners of the debt, and they're here to collect." Black Jack knew what this meant. It was a trap, a new kind of trap. They weren't here for a gunfight. They were here for a negotiation that would inevitably end in him losing something. "I won't meet with them," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "They're a bunch of vipers. They'll try to get me to sign something, to give up my land. I won't do it." "They're a different kind of threat, John," Sam said. "They're smarter. They're not just here for a fight. They're here to use the law against you. They're here to take everything you've built." Emma stepped forward, her heart pounding in her chest. "They're the ones who killed my father, aren't they?" she said, her voice a raw whisper. Sam nodded grimly. "They were hired guns, hired by a man named Alistair Finch. He's the one who now owns the debt. He's the one they say you owe." The name was a shock. Alistair Finch, a name whispered with fear and respect throughout the county. A man who was not a cowboy, but a powerful, ruthless businessman. A man who used the law as a weapon, who bought and sold lives as if they were cattle. "I won't meet with him," Blackjack repeated, his voice firm. "I won't give him the satisfaction. He wants my land. He can't have it." But the Brandons had a new kind of weapon. They had the law. And in the West, the law was a fragile, often corrupt thing. "They're waiting at the county line," Sam said. "They say you have until sundown. If you don't show up, they'll come for you. And this time they'll bring the law with them." Blackjack's jaw was set in a hard line. He was a man who lived by his own rules, and the idea of being forced to play by someone else's was a galling prospect. "I'll meet them," he said, his voice a low, final word. "But I won't be alone. We'll ride out together. We'll show them that we are not a man and a boy. We are a family." Emma's heart sank. She knew what this meant. He was not just going to a meeting. He was going to a confrontation. A confrontation not with guns, but with words, with contracts, with a kind of a cruelty that was more insidious than any bullet. She watched him as he prepared to leave. He was not just a cowboy, not just a rancher. He was a man who had built an empire, and now he was faced with a new kind of war. A war not of muscle and guns, but of cunning and law. A war he was not prepared for. "Be careful, John," she said, her voice filled with a desperate plea. "Please, they're not like us. They don't fight fair." He looked at her, his eyes holding a grim, determined fire. "I know," he said, "but I have to go, for us, for our future." He kissed her, a brief, gentle kiss that was more powerful than any embrace. It was a kiss of a man who was fighting not just for his land, but for his family. He mounted his horse and rode away, a solitary figure against the vast, unforgiving landscape. And Emma stood there, a woman with a new life within her, watching a man who was fighting a new kind of battle, a battle she was powerless to help him win. The ghost of the past had returned, and it was here to take everything. Blackjack and his men rode to the county line, a grim and silent procession. They found the Brandons waiting, a dozen armed men, their faces a mask of hostility. At the front of the group was a man in a fine, tailored suit, a man whose hands were not calloused from hard work, but soft and pale from a life of leisure. This was Alistair Finch. "John Callahan," Finch said, his voice a smooth, cultured purr. "A pleasure to meet you. I've heard so much about you. A legend in your own time. But legends, my friend, are just stories. I deal in reality." Blackjack dismounted, his face a mask of indifference. "What do you want, Finch? The debt was paid. It was settled." "On the contrary," Finch said, a cruel smile on his lips. "Your debt was paid to a man who had no right to it. The original owner, a man I now represent, was swindled out of his claim. He's been waiting for his money, and now he wants it. $3,000 plus interest. $10,000 in total." The number was a staggering sum, a sum that would cripple even a man of Blackjack's wealth. It was a number designed to break him. "This is a ruse," Blackjack said, his voice a low growl. "A lie. You're here for my land." "The land is collateral," Finch said smoothly, "a token of good faith. But if you can't pay, well, the law is on our side. You see, I am not a man of guns. I am a man of contracts, of the law. And the law, Mr. Callahan, is a much more dangerous weapon than any pistol." He held out a thick legal document, the deed to your land, a small, simple transaction. You sign it and you walk away, or you fight and you lose everything. Blackjack looked at the document, his eyes filled with a simmering rage. He was a man who lived by the law of the West, a law of honor and strength. This man, this worm, was using a different kind of law, a law that was alien to him, a law he couldn't fight with a gun. "I won't sign it," he said, his voice a low, firm word. "The land is mine. It was bought with blood and sweat. It is my legacy." "Your legacy?" Finch laughed, a short, bitter sound. "Your legacy is a woman and a child who will have nothing. I own your future, Mr. Callahan. I own your debt, and I will take everything from you, piece by piece, until you have nothing left. Unless you can pay. You have 1 week." He turned to his men. "Boys, you know what to do. Take the cattle. Let's see how the great Blackjack Callahan deals with a little inconvenience." The Brandons, a vicious gleam in their eyes, began to round up the cattle. Blackjack and his men watched, their hands on their guns, their faces filled with a helpless fury. They were outnumbered, they were outmaneuvered, they were losing. "I will be back, Callahan," Finch said, a cold smile on his lips. "And when I do, you will have a choice. Your family's future or your pride. Choose wisely." He mounted his horse and rode away, a man of power and cunning, leaving Blackjack in a world that had suddenly become foreign and frightening. Blackjack rode back to the ranch, his face a mask of grim defeat. He had lost. He had been outsmarted. He had been beaten by a man who used a weapon he couldn't fight. He was a man of the West, a man of guns, and he had just been defeated by a man of paper. When he arrived at the ranch, Emma saw the look on his face and her heart sank. She knew. He had lost. "What did he want?" she asked, her voice a raw whisper. "He wants the ranch," Blackjack said, his voice a low, defeated growl. "He wants everything, and he has the law on his side. He's a different kind of enemy, Emma, a man I can't fight with a gun." He walked to his study, a man who had lost his way. Emma followed him, her mind racing. This was not the kind of fight she had expected. This was not a physical confrontation. It was a battle of wits, a battle she knew he would lose. But she had to help him. She was no longer just a woman who had been a part of this deal. She was a woman who was a part of this family, and she would not stand by and watch it be destroyed. She was a fighter in her own way, and she was about to fight a new kind of battle, a battle for her home, for her future, for the man she had come to love. The news of the debt and Finch's threat spread through the ranch like a plague. The men who had been so loyal to Blackjack now looked at him with a new, a different kind of fear. They were not afraid of Brandon and his men. They were afraid of the law. They were afraid of losing their jobs, their homes, their futures. Blackjack, for his part, was a man in a state of quiet despair. He would sit in his study, a stack of legal documents on his desk, his face a grim, unreadable mask. He was a man who had built his life with his hands, and now he was faced with a war he could not fight. Emma, for her part, refused to give in. She would bring him his meals, and in the evenings she would sit with him, a quiet, resolute presence. "What are we going to do?" she asked one evening, her voice filled with a quiet determination. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a grim, defeated resignation. "There's nothing to do, Emma. He has the law. He has the papers. I can't fight that. It's over." "It's not over," she said, her voice firm. "We'll fight it. We'll find a way." He scoffed, a short, humorless sound. "How? You can't shoot a contract, Emma. You can't beat a man who uses the law as a weapon." "Maybe you can't," she said, her voice filled with a defiant confidence. "But I can." He looked at her, his eyes a question. "What do you mean?" Emma walked to his desk and picked up the legal document. She began to read it, her eyes scanning the complex, convoluted language. She had not had a formal education, but her father had taught her to read and write. She was a woman of the West, but she was a woman of words as well. As she read, she saw it. A small, almost imperceptible detail. A small but crucial flaw in the contract. A loophole, a way out. "It's here," she said, her voice filled with a new, powerful excitement. "The original loan agreement. It states that the loan must be paid in full to the original lender, not to a proxy, not to a lawyer. to the man who gave the money. Blackjack's eyes widened. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," she said, her voice filled with a triumphant certainty, "that this man, Finch, is a fraud. He has no right to this debt. He can't collect. He can't take our land, because the contract says he can't." Blackjack stared at her, his face a mixture of disbelief and awe. He had been so focused on the big picture, on the threat of the law, that he had missed the small, crucial detail. The woman he had taken as a payment for a debt had just found a way to save him. "You're a genius, Emma," he said, a rare, full-throated laugh erupting from him. "A goddamn genius." He took the document from her and looked at it, his eyes scanning the words she had pointed to. He saw it, the small, simple yet crucial loophole, the key to their freedom. "Now what?" he asked, his voice filled with a renewed sense of purpose. "Now," Emma said, her voice a calm, powerful statement, "we go to the law. We go to the county judge. We present our case. We show them that Finch is a fraud. We fight him with his own weapon." Blackjack looked at her, a profound sense of respect and awe on his face. She was not just a woman who had given him a new life. She was a woman who had just saved him from a fate worse than death. She was not just a wife. She was a partner, a true equal. The next morning, Blackjack and Emma rode to the county seat, a small, bustling town filled with the chaos and promise of the West. They went to the courthouse, a small, simple building, and requested a meeting with the judge. The judge, a stern-faced man with a kind heart, listened to their story. He listened to Finch's claims, and he listened to Emma's explanation. He read the documents, his eyes scanning the fine print, and then he looked up, a small, knowing smile on his face. "Alistair Finch," he said, his voice a low, firm word. "He is a man of many schemes, but he is not a man of the law. You have a valid claim, Mrs. Callahan. Your husband owes nothing. The debt is invalid." The words were a victory. A triumph of good over evil, of a simple, honest truth over a complex, insidious lie. Blackjack's face was a mixture of relief and pure, unadulterated joy. He had not only saved his ranch, but he had also saved his honor, his legacy. And he had done it not with a gun, but with the help of a woman who had taught him that the pen could be a more powerful weapon than the sword. The news of the legal victory spread through the county like a cleansing rain. Blackjack Callahan, the man who had been outsmarted by a ruthless lawyer, had been saved by his wife, a woman who had used her wits to defeat a man of cunning and guile. He was no longer just a legend. He was a man with a heart, a man who had found a partner, a true equal. The ranch was filled with a palpable sense of relief and celebration. The men, who had been so worried about their future, were now filled with a renewed sense of loyalty and respect for their boss and for his wife. They saw her not just as Mrs. Callahan, but as the woman who had saved them all. Blackjack, for his part, was a man transformed. The weight of his past, the burden of his debt, the fear of his future, was gone. He was free. And he was not free because he had fought and won with a gun. He was free because he had trusted a woman who had taught him that true strength was not in a clenched fist, but in an open heart. One evening, as they were sitting by the fireplace, the silence between them filled with a quiet, companionable warmth, Emma spoke. "The Brandons. What about them?" she asked, her voice soft. "They're gone," Blackjack said, his voice a low, gentle rumble. "Finch took their money and they lost their claim. They're ruined. There'll be a story for the history books." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a different kind of emotion. It was not gratitude. It was not respect. It was love. A deep, profound, and undeniable love. "And you," he said, his voice a low, gravelly whisper. "You are my hero, Emma. You saved me. You saved us all." Emma smiled, a gentle, humble smile. "I just did what had to be done. We're a team, John. We're a family." He nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving her face. He was a man of the West, a man of few words, but he knew what he had to say. He knew what he had to do. He reached out and took her hands, his large calloused fingers wrapping around hers. He looked at her, his eyes a mixture of awe and profound love. "I asked you to be my wife to pay a debt," he said, his voice a low, painful confession. "I asked you to bear me heirs to an empire. I was a broken man, Emma, a man who had forgotten how to live. But you showed me how. You taught me that there is more to life than just survival, that there is love, that there is a family, that there is a future." He leaned in, his lips a breath away from hers. "I am not asking you for a deal, Emma. I am not asking you for a favor. I am not asking you for an heir. I am asking you to be my wife, my partner, my love. I am asking you to be mine, not because of a debt, but because I love you, more than anything in this world." The words were a shock, a sudden, powerful confession that left her speechless. This man of stone, had just confessed his love for her. And in that moment, she knew that she had loved him too. She had loved him for his strength, for his quiet vulnerability, for the gentle heart he had hidden beneath a fortress of stone. She reached out and touched his face, her fingers tracing the hard lines of a life lived in a harsh world. "I love you too, John," she said, her voice a soft, beautiful whisper. "I have loved you for a long time." He kissed her then, a kiss that was not a cold, dutiful touch, but a kiss of pure, unadulterated love. A kiss that was a promise, a vow, a testament to a love story that had begun in a moment of desperation and had ended in a triumph of the heart. The poor girl had cried for her father's loan until the cowboy had demanded she bear him heirs as payment. But in the end, the debt had been paid not with a child, but with a love that was more valuable than any empire, a love that was a true legacy, a love that was a new beginning. The legal victory over Finch was a triumph of wit over brute force, a victory that Emma had orchestrated with her keen mind. It solidified her position not just as Black Jack's wife, but as his indispensable partner. The ranch felt a profound sense of peace. The Brandons were a vanquished memory, and Finch a defeated ghost. The future, once so uncertain, now stretched out before them, a vast and hopeful landscape. Black Jack was a man reborn. The weight of his past, the haunting memory of his first family, no longer seemed to hold him captive. Emma's love and the promise of their child had become a beacon of hope, a new purpose that eclipsed his old sorrows. He was still a man of the West, strong, silent, and formidable, but there was a new softness around the edges, a quiet vulnerability that only Emma and their unborn child could bring out. He spent his days on the ranch, working alongside his men, but his evenings were devoted to Emma. He would sit with her in the nursery, his large hands carefully sanding and polishing the wooden crib he was building. It was a simple, beautiful piece of furniture, crafted with a dedication that spoke volumes of his newfound joy. He was no longer just building an empire. He was building a home. He was building a legacy for a child he was already learning to love. One evening, as he was working on the crib, Emma came in and found him staring at it, his face a mixture of hope and fear. "What is it, John?" she asked, her voice soft. He looked up at her, his eyes holding a deep, profound sadness. "I'm so afraid, Emma. My last son, he died so young. I never got to see him grow. I never got to be his father." His voice was a raw, painful whisper, a confession he had been holding in for so long. "What if I fail again? What if I'm not a good father?" Emma knelt beside him, her hand on his arm. "You won't fail, John, you won't. You are already a good father. You are building this crib with your own hands. You are protecting us from the world. You are here. That is all that matters. You will love them, and they will know that. That is enough." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a different kind of tears. Not tears of sorrow, but tears of hope. He was a man who had been alone for so long, a man who had been a father to no one. And now he was a man who had a family. He was a man who was learning to trust, to love, to hope. He put down his tools and wrapped his arms around her, a protective, powerful embrace that was more comforting than any words. He held her, his head resting against her stomach, listening to the soft, rhythmic kick of the new life within. The promise of a new life, a new beginning, was a balm to his old wounds. "Thank you, Emma," he said, his voice a low, gravelly whisper. "For giving me this chance. For giving us a future." The silence that followed was a profound and beautiful thing. It was a silence of a man who was no longer just a fighter, but a protector. A man who was no longer just an empire builder, but a father. He had made a silent vow of fatherhood, a promise to protect, to love, to cherish the new life that was coming into their world. And in that moment, Emma knew that their love story was not just a story of a poor girl and a rich cowboy. It was a story of a man who had found his way home. As the due date drew near, the ranch was abuzz with a sense of anticipation. The Cowboys, who had been so stoic and silent, were now filled with a boyish excitement. They would ask Emma about her day, about how she was feeling, their faces filled with a genuine, quiet concern. Clara, the housekeeper, was a whirlwind of maternal energy, fussing over Emma, making sure she was well fed and rested. The whole ranch, once a place of hardened men and stoic silence, was now filled with a soft, palpable sense of a family waiting for its newest member. Black Jack was a man of quiet but profound anxiety. He was still the strong, silent leader of the ranch, but there was a new, almost imperceptible tremor in his hands. He would often wake in the middle of the night, his face a grim, haunted mask, the ghost of his past fears returning. Emma would find him sitting on the edge of the bed, his head in his hands, and she would simply reach out and take his hand. "It's going to be okay, John," she would whisper, her voice a calm, reassuring presence in the darkness. "We are going to be okay. We are going to be a family." He would nod, a silent, powerful acknowledgement, and he would hold her hand, his fear slowly, imperceptibly receding. The day of the birth came suddenly, a rush of pain and panic that sent a jolt of alarm through the ranch. The doctor, a kind and gentle man, was on his way, but the labor was coming fast. Emma's heart was pounding, but her mind was calm. She was a woman of the West, a woman who had faced down loss and despair, and she would face this with the same quiet strength. Black Jack was a man transformed. His usual calm exterior was gone, replaced by a raw, naked fear. He was a man who had faced down a dozen men with guns, but the sight of Emma in pain, the sound of her cries, was a torment he could not bear. "It's going to be okay, John," she said, her voice filled with a desperate, painful plea. "Just stay with me. Please, don't go." He sat with her, his large hands holding hers, his face pale with fear. He was not a man of comfort, not a man of words, but he was a man of presence. He was there. And that was enough. The labor was long and hard, a battle of endurance and strength. Emma was a warrior, a woman who had been through so much, and she was fighting for the life of her child. Black Jack was her anchor, his hand a solid, unyielding presence in the midst of her pain. And then, as the sun was beginning to set, a new sound filled the room. A cry, a small, perfect, beautiful cry. Emma, exhausted but filled with a profound joy, looked up and saw her baby, a small, tiny bundle in the doctor's arms. It was a boy, a beautiful, healthy baby boy. Black Jack, his face a mixture of tears and a wide, beautiful smile, looked at his son. He was a father again, a father to a new life, a new legacy. The doctor, a kind and gentle man, placed the baby in his father's arms. Black Jack held his son, a small, fragile being, in his large, powerful hands. He was a man who had held guns, who had held the reins of an empire, and now he was holding a new life. A life that was not a payment for a debt, but a gift of a love he had never thought he would have. He looked at Emma, his eyes filled with a new, a profound love. "He has your eyes," he said, his voice a low, choked whisper, "and your strength. He's a warrior like you." He leaned in and kissed her, a kiss of love, of gratitude, of a shared life and a shared future. The poor girl had cried for her father's loan, but she had given the cowboy a new life, a new family and a new legacy. And in the quiet of the room, as the three of them were together, a family was born. A family that was not just a collection of individuals, but a bond of love that was stronger than any debt, any conflict, any loss. The arrival of the baby boy, was a celebration that echoed throughout the ranch. The Cowboys, a group of hardened, stoic men, now gathered around the ranch house, their faces filled with a quiet, a profound joy. They had watched their leader, a man of stone and steel, find his way home, and they were a part of that journey. The days that followed were a blur of new life and new routines. Emma was a natural mother, her hands and heart filled with a profound, unconditional love. She would spend her days with the baby, her voice a soft, gentle hum as she rocked him in the rocking chair, her heart filled with a joy she had never thought possible. Black Jack, for his part, was a silent and watchful father. He would sit for hours, a grim, unreadable mask on his face, but his eyes were filled with a raw, powerful love. He would hold his son, his large hands surprisingly gentle, his movements slow and deliberate. He was a man who had built an empire, and now his greatest treasure was a small, fragile being who had no idea of the power he held over his father's heart. One evening, as Emma was holding the baby, Black Jack came into the room, a serious look on his face. "We need to name him," he said, his voice a low, firm word. Emma looked up at him, a small, knowing smile on her lips. "I've been thinking about it," she said. "What do you think?" He was silent for a moment, his eyes filled with a deep, profound emotion. "My pa. He wanted me to be like him. Strong, hard, a man of the land. He never saw me as anything else. But my mother, she saw something else. She saw a man who could be gentle, a man who could be kind. She saw a man who could love." He looked at his son, his face filled with a new, a different kind of love. "I want him to have the best of both of us, Emma, the strength of the land and the gentleness of a kind heart." He looked at Emma, his eyes a question. "I want to name him Elias, after your father. He was a good man, Emma. He was a man of honor, a man who loved his family. He gave me a gift I will cherish for the rest of my life." Emma's eyes welled with tears. She had lost her father, but he would live on in the name of her son. The man who had been the source of her sorrow was now the source of her greatest joy. The debt had not been a curse, but a blessing. "And his middle name?" she asked, her voice a raw whisper. Black Jack's face softened. "His middle name, it will be John, after me. But not Black Jack Callahan, the rancher, just John. A man who is learning how to love, a man who is learning how to be a father." Emma's heart was filled with a love so profound it almost hurt. She had come here to pay a debt, to be a wife of convenience, and now she was a mother, a wife, a woman who had found her purpose, her home, her family. She looked at her son, Elias John. He was a child of two worlds, a child who had the strength of his father and the gentle heart of his mother. He was a child who was not a part of a deal, but a part of a love story that had begun with a loan and had ended in a family. And in the quiet of the room, as the three of them were together, a new chapter of their lives began. A chapter of a family, a chapter of a love that was stronger than any debt, any conflict, any loss. A chapter of a new legacy, a legacy of a cowboy who had found his way home, a legacy of a woman who had found her purpose, a legacy of a boy who would have a life filled with love, a life that was a testament to the power of a heart that was open to change. As the baby Elias grew, so too did the love between Emma and John. Their marriage, once a transaction, was now a true partnership, a bond of love and trust that was deeper than any legal document. John was a man transformed. He was no longer just the silent, brooding rancher. He was a father, a husband, a man who had found his purpose in a world he had once believed was devoid of warmth. The ranch, a place that had once been a bastion of masculine austerity, was now a home. The sound of a baby's laughter filled the halls, a sound so full of pure, unadulterated joy that it took John's breath away. He would sit for hours, his son in his lap, his heart filled with a profound, a quiet sense of awe. This was his legacy, not the land, not the cattle, not the empire. His legacy was the love he had found, the family he had built. One evening, as Emma was putting Elias to bed, John came into the nursery, a serious look on his face. "I need to do something," he said. his voice a low, firm word. "Something for your father, for Elias." Emma looked at him, her heart filled with a quiet, a knowing sense of pride. He was a man who had been a creature of the West, a man of few words, but he was a man of action. The next morning John rode out, a small group of his men by his side. They rode to the land that had been Elias Carter's, the land that was now a part of the Callahan Empire, the land that had been the cause of so much pain, so much loss. They began to work, not with guns, but with their hands. They tore down the old dilapidated barn, the barn where Emma's father had been killed. They replaced it with a new one, a strong, sturdy barn, a barn that was a testament to a new beginning. They rebuilt the house, a house that was no longer a place of sorrow but a place of hope. The project took weeks, a labor of love and a tribute to a man who had been a good man, a man who had loved his family. John worked with his men, his hands covered in dirt, his face a mask of grim determination. He was not just building a barn, he was building a memorial. He was building a tribute to a man who had given him the greatest gift of all. When the work was finished, John stood there, a man of power and authority, but a man who was now a man of love and grace. He looked at the land, the new barn, the new house, and a sense of profound peace settled over him. He had paid the debt, not with a life, but with a promise to honor the memory of a good man, a promise to build a new life on the ashes of the old. He rode back to the ranch, his heart filled with a quiet sense of a profound accomplishment. He was not just a man who had built an empire. He was a man who had built a life. He was a man who had found his redemption, a man who had found his home, a man who had found his love. The poor girl had cried for her father's loan, but she had given the cowboy a new life, a new family, a new purpose. And in the quiet of the evening, as he held his son in his arms, he knew that his greatest treasure was not the land, not the cattle, but the love he had found, a love that was a true legacy, a love that was a new beginning. The first year of Elias's life was a whirlwind of new experiences and quiet joys for Emma and John. Their love, once a fragile seed, had blossomed into a strong, beautiful tree, its roots planted deep in the fertile soil of their shared lives. They were a family, a true family, and their home was a place of warmth, laughter, and a profound, quiet love. As Christmas approached, Emma felt a surge of excitement. She had not celebrated Christmas since her mother died, but now, with a baby in her arms, with a husband who was no longer a stranger, she felt a powerful, a profound desire to celebrate. She began to decorate the house, a small, humble beginning. She made garlands out of pine branches, hung hand-carved ornaments on the small Christmas tree, and baked gingerbread cookies that filled the air with a sweet, comforting scent. John, for his part, was a silent and watchful participant. He had not celebrated Christmas since he was a boy, since his mother had died. The holiday was a painful memory for him, a reminder of a past he had tried so hard to forget. But as he watched Emma, her face filled with a radiant, a quiet joy, he felt anew a different kind of feeling, a feeling of hope, of a new beginning. He found himself helping her, his large, calloused hands surprisingly gentle as he hung the garlands, as he lit the candles, as he carried the heavy boxes of decorations. He was not just helping her, he was helping himself. He was healing a wound he had been carrying for so long. On Christmas Eve, the ranch was a scene of quiet, a profound celebration. The men who had been so stoic and silent were now filled with a boyish excitement. They had a home now, a family, and a Christmas to celebrate. Emma and John, with Elias in their arms, stood by the fireplace, the crackle of the fire a soft, comforting sound. The house was filled with the scent of pine and cinnamon, the sound of a baby's laughter, the quiet, peaceful presence of a family that had found its way home. John looked at Emma, his eyes filled with a profound love. This is the first time I've felt like this in so long," he said, his voice a low, choked whisper. "This is what my mother tried to teach me. This is what you have given me. A home, a family." He looked at Elias, his son, a small, tiny bundle, sleeping peacefully in his arms. He was a man who had been a creature of the West, a man of few words, but he knew what he had to say. He knew what he had to do. "Thank you, Emma," he said, his voice a low, profound whisper, "for giving me this, for giving me a family, for giving me a life." She reached out and took his hand, her fingers wrapping around his. "This is not a gift, John," she said, her voice filled with a quiet, a profound love. "This is our life, our family, our home, and this is just the beginning." As the clock struck midnight, marking the beginning of a new day, a new year, a new chapter, a profound sense of peace settled over them. The poor girl had cried for her father's loan, but she had given the cowboy a new life, a new family, a new purpose. And in the quiet of the night, as the three of them were together, they knew that their love story was not just a story of a debt, but a story of a love that was a true legacy, a love that was a new beginning. The years that followed were a testament to the power of a love that was not born of convenience, but of a shared journey of loss and redemption. Elias grew into a healthy, happy boy, his eyes filled with the gentle kindness of his mother and the quiet strength of his father. He was a boy of two worlds, a boy who was not just an heir, but a son, a boy who had a family, a boy who was a part of a love story that was more beautiful than any legend. The Callahan Ranch, once a symbol of a ruthless, solitary empire, was now a symbol of a family, a home. The Cowboys, who had been so stoic and silent, were now a part of the family. They would gather around the fireplace in the evenings, their faces filled with a quiet, a profound joy. They had a home, a family, and a purpose. John, for his part, was a man who was no longer just a rancher. He was a father, a husband, a man who had found his purpose in a world he had once believed was devoid of warmth. He would spend his days on the ranch, working with his men, but his evenings were devoted to his family. He would sit with Elias on his lap, his voice a low, comforting rumble as he read to him from the books he had once read in solitude. He was not just a father. He was a man who was learning how to be a father, a man who was learning how to love. One evening, as Emma and John were sitting by the fireplace, the sound of Elias's laughter echoing in the halls, John turned to Emma, his eyes filled with a profound love. "I asked you to be my wife to pay a debt," he said, his voice a low, gravelly whisper. "I asked you to bear me an heir. I was a broken man, Emma, a man who had forgotten how to live. But you showed me how. You taught me that there is more to life than just survival, that there is love, that there is a family, that there is a future." Emma reached out and touched his face, her fingers tracing the hard lines of a life lived in a harsh world. "This is not a debt, John," she said, her voice filled with a quiet, a profound love. "This is our life, our family, our home, and this is just the beginning." He smiled, a rare, genuine smile that transformed his entire face. He was not just a man of power. He was a man of grace, a man who had found his redemption, a man who had found his home. The years that followed were a testament to the power of a love that was not born of convenience, but of a shared journey of loss and redemption. They were a family, a true family, and their home was a place of warmth, laughter, and a profound, quiet love. The poor girl had cried for her father's loan, but she had given the cowboy a new life, a new family, a new purpose. And in the quiet of the evening, as they sat together, the sound of their son's laughter filling the air, they knew that their love story was not just a story of a debt, but a story of a love that was a true legacy, a love that was a new beginning. The years had been kind to the Callahan Ranch. The land, once a place of dust and despair, was now a fertile, prosperous empire. The house, once a symbol of a man's solitude, was now a home filled with the warmth and laughter of a family. Emma and John were no longer a young couple in a marriage of convenience. They were a man and a woman who had found their way home, a man and a woman who had built a love that was more powerful than any gold, more valuable than any empire. Elias, their son, was now a young man, a boy who had the strength of his father and the gentle heart of his mother. He was a man of the West, a man of honor, but he was also a man who had been raised with love, a man who had been taught that true strength was not in a clenched fist, but in an open heart. One evening, as Emma and John were sitting by the fireplace, the sound of Elias's laughter echoing in the halls, John turned to Emma, his eyes filled with a profound love. "I asked you to be my wife to pay a debt," he said, his voice a low, gravelly whisper. "I was a broken man, Emma, a man who had forgotten how to live. But you showed me how. You taught me that there is more to life than just survival, that there is love, that there is a family, that there is a future." Emma reached out and took his hand, her fingers, now wrinkled with age, wrapping around his. "This is not a debt, John," she said, her voice filled with a profound love. "This is our life, our family, our home, and this is just the beginning." He smiled, a rare, genuine smile that transformed his entire face. He was not just a man of power, he was a man of grace, a man who had found his redemption, a man who had found his home. The years had been kind, but they had also been a testament to the enduring power of a love that was not born of convenience, but of a shared journey of loss and redemption. They were a family, a true family, and their home was a place of warmth, laughter, and a profound, quiet love. The poor girl had cried for her father's loan, but she had given the cowboy a new life, a new family, a new purpose. And in the quiet of the evening, as they sat together, the sound of their son's laughter filling the air, they knew that their love story was not just a story of a debt, but a story of a love that was a true legacy, a love that was a new beginning. The sun set on the Callahan Ranch, a crimson and gold spectacle on the horizon. The heart of the West was no longer a place of solitude, but a place of family. The heart of the cowboy was no longer a fortress of stone, but a wellspring of love. And in the quiet of the evening, a new story began, a story of a family, a story of a love that was stronger than any conflict, any loss, any debt.